Hello, YouTube. This is Peter with you once again. It is the Friday after the election, and barring a series of unlikely circumstances, it is all over but the crying MAGA edition. Now, I have many thoughts on this election. I'm probably going to ramble a bit, although I did write down some notes on a whiteboard that I got next to me to refer to when I need to. I'm using my camcorder because it's easier to record on this for long periods of time, although the video quality is not as good. But let's get into it. So what was my election night like? I found it interesting. Election week is a better, more accurate way to put it. Well, first of all, I chose to mostly ignore what was going on with the election until roughly 10 o'clock at night, 10:30-ish. That's when I started to take a hard look at what was going on. And, well, let's just say I chose the worst possible time to choose to look at the results coming in, because that turned out to be pretty much Trump's high watermark. And looking back on certain betting sites and what the odds were at different times, that's where he peaked. It was right around the time that I was looking. So obviously I had some feelings about that and, had some dark thoughts about where the future might lead us. But then by the time I went to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, things had wound down considerably, although still seemed concerning. And by the time I woke up on the next morning and looked, 12 hours later, or around 10 o'clock, I'm looking at things again. Things are getting a lot better. By about 11:30, 12 o'clock, I'm scrolling through Trump's Twitter, and I'm scrolling through Trumpistan Twitter, not President Trump's Twitter account. And what I'm seeing is starting to feel very familiar, just the inverse of 4 years ago. So 4 years ago, on election night, there was a lot of Democrats, and many of them who were my friends, I saw on Facebook and Twitter and other places, who were saying, no, I think that they called this state too early, and the results haven't come in from this county in this state, and we could still win, Pennsylvania. They're going to do a recount in Wisconsin. There was a lot of increasingly reaching and far-fetched scenarios about how victory would be snatched from the jaws of defeat for Hillary Clinton. And on Wednesday morning, 11 o'clock-ish, going through Trumpistan Twitter, that's the sort of thing that I was seeing from Trumpists, alongside their obvious, this is rigged, they're stealing it, etc., which I'll come back to. But no, you know what? I'm going to get to it right now. Those of you who have been watching videos on my channel and videos like mine for a long time are probably familiar with the phrase, that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I'm willing to accept the possibility that there may be some problems with some ballots. But these claims of widespread voter fraud that would account for tens of thousands of ballots, proof or get out. They are making this stuff up. This is a narrative that they have been building up basically since it became clear months ago that a large number of votes were to come in as mail-in ballots. They've been building up this narrative. This was a thing that Trump talked about even going back to 2016. The only way I could lose is if it's rigged. He was always hedging his bets even then. So none of this is surprising or new. It's certainly pathetic, and it's detrimental to the health of democracy in our country, but I wish I could say I was surprised. So, going back to roughly Wednesday afternoon, starting to feel much better, and it's just been a slow ride into the shores of certainty. It's pretty much, we are wading through the shallows now onto the shores of certainty that Joe Biden has won and Trump has been defeated. Will he go down without all sorts of crybaby legal shenanigans? Obviously not. I don't think he's psychologically capable of accepting a defeat like this. And things are going to get interesting. Things in some cases might even get violent. But on the other hand, I don't see a complete mass insurrection that you might expect if the nearly 70 million people who voted for Trump actually were true believers. The actual core of Trump's true believers is much smaller than the amount of people who voted for him, which dovetails into the next subject. Why was it closer than we expected? Now, why were the polls wrong? They're probably just not asking enough of the right people. It's, various and sundry factors throwing off the samples. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a pollster. So, obviously, polls being significantly wrong. But a lot of people obviously had a similar experience to I did, where roughly, 10:30 election night, they had to face the significant possibility of Trump winning, or at least it appeared that way. And it got us reflecting, how is it so close again? Well, let me give a very brief rundown of some of my views on this. Number one, I think that regardless of the way that politically engaged people might want to view the rest of the electorate, and we might want to look at ourselves as a nation, as a people, and think, we have qualities X, Y, and Z. The truth is much different and much more sad. And they have to view, in order to understand these things, I think you have to view things from a completely different psychological perspective. So if there's anything that the last 4 years has taught me, is that a lot of people can shrug off and ignore pretty much anything Trump has done. There seems to be no point at which a vast number of committed conservatives and Republicans are going to say, you know what, this is enough. There's, of course, people at the fringes. There are people like, the Lincoln Project who don't expect to hear of them supporting any Democratic candidates in the future. They're going to, scurry back to whatever reasonably respectable Republicans they can still find at this point. But you have a lot of what's called low information voters. They don't pay enough attention, and they're not ideologically committed enough to care. And if there's one thing human beings are really great at doing, it's rationalizing things away and shrugging their shoulders at things. I think that a lot of people, from their own perspective, they have a clear sense of right and wrong. They have some degree of ideological conviction. And when you take those things away and you get into the mindset of a poorly informed, semi-apathetic, average voter, then you're in a completely different situation. And when you combine the diehard Trump loyalists with the cynical Republicans, with the low information voters who are willing to shrug off, the things that Trump has done, it's perfectly understandable how it could be so close, given the overall, attitudes and breakdown of our country. In other words, there's people who lean conservative anyway who can rationalize and shrug off what Trump has done. And Trump has a unique cult of personality surrounding him, or a seemingly unique. That's another subject I'll touch on. But as I've stated in past videos, I grew up what you would call a military brat. I was born on an Air Force base. Growing up, I thought that all movies began with the national anthem and a montage of Air Force jets, because we would go see movies at the base theater. I grew up with a very patriotic, very pro-America, we're the good guys worldview from a Republican family. And I understand the conservative mindset better than a lot of conservatives would like to think. They would like to think that everyone who disagrees with them just couldn't possibly get where they're coming from. I don't think that's so. But as I grew older and my opinions changed, I came to realize, amongst other things, that we as a people, the American people, were sometimes not so great. Let's put it that way. And I think one of the first early wake-up calls for me was in the years immediately after September 11th, in leading up to the Iraq invasion, in the early years of the Iraq invasion. Because as much as people would like to remember that time as a moment of national unity where we came together, I still remember the palpable bloodlust amongst Americans at that time. I still remember going into a store where a woman, I believe the woman was Muslim, but I'm not certain. She was certainly an immigrant who ran the store with her husband, was clearly terrified, looking at American flag, or some product with an American flag on it. And she's like, yes, I love America. We love America. And I could sense the terror in this woman. And I could only imagine how she was being treated by other Americans. And I remember how eager people were to invade Iraq, to kill whatever Muslims the president was willing to bomb because of September 11th. Now, of course, 15, 16 years on, all these years on, you now have conservatives and Republicans saying what a terrible idea it was. I still remember how eager people were to go to war. I still remember the bloodlust. I still remember we should just nuke the whole Middle East. And the callousness and the glee at which they thought of vengeance. That was one of my first major experiences of realizing that maybe we as a country are not so great. I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but I remember support for the Iraq War was a lot higher amongst the public than we would tend to like to believe. Of course, it was protested by record-setting numbers of people. Before the war even started, it was protested more from the beginning than any other war. But there was also, very, very high support because the American people wanted vengeance. I still remember that. Of course, next major disappointment, or one of the next major disappointments, not only was Bush being reelected, which is its whole own thing, but Trump being elected. There was, for me, a moment where it's like, yes, there are really that many people willing to go down this path. That said something else about the American people. And then, with the coronavirus, the number of people who just, I'm not going to wear a mask because my freedom, going to state courthouses armed and essentially threatening armed insurrection because they can't get a haircut, because somebody is trying to tell them that they should wear a mask to help stop the spread of an infectious disease. And I've seen a lot of the, I'm not going to wear a mask, this is all fake. I mean, and amongst all of the shenanigans, of all the things that we can point and place the blame on Trump for, of what's happened in the last 4 years, just average, everyday people have reacted to this pandemic in such an asinine fashion that I can only count it as a black mark against the United States as a people. If this election has taught us anything, it is that the battle for the soul of America is far, far from over. And in reality, we could be facing this all over again in another 4 years. Now, I don't know if, Trump 2024 would have the same veneer that Trump 2020 or Trump 2016 did, because he'll have lost, and there's going to be some bleeding away. It depends on how he can angle the party. But this is why I personally believe that all of the legal action and lawsuits that are pending against Trump, that he has only been able to shield himself from by virtue of the president, need to go ahead full steam. I want to see his business empire torn down. I want to see those tax bills come due. I want to see the loans called. And maybe he will survive all of that. Maybe they're all spurious lawsuits. Maybe he'll be able to, skate away from that. But I think there's a significant possibility that he's going to be in for a real reckoning once he leaves office on numerous fronts. Consequences are coming for Trump. So I'm not sure how much we really have to contemplate a Trump 2024 run. He'll be much older then. Who knows what this defeat will do to him psychologically? Who knows how he'll angle it? He'll probably still try and be a power player and a power broker within the Republican Party. People are already talking about him spinning off a media empire. He's going to have a lot of a lot on his plate, and a lot of his potential presidential campaign is probably just going to be to bolster his own ego. That being said, though, what about another Republican candidate? There, I have slightly more hope. I have a tiny sliver of hope because I think to a certain extent, what Trump did could not be easily repeated. And cults of personality, they have to have the right personality. It's sort of like looking at the Democratic Party after Barack Obama was leaving office. There was a lot of talk of, well, who's going to take up the mantle now? Who has that kind of charisma and support behind him? And a lot of people looked at the Democratic field, excluding Bernie Sanders, and said, yeah, no one's quite on that level. And part of what made Trump overperform, in my opinion, not even in my opinion, I think this is more or less objectively true, is his diehard support, is his ability to reach what might otherwise be politically apathetic and disengaged, angry people. And if I had to explain to a historian, to a curious person, to people in other countries, to time travelers from the future, in one sentence, what I thought made Trump so successful, I would say this. I would say that I think that he gives his followers a sense of empowerment that is incredibly rare in representative democracy. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that typically politics is a bunch of tepid, two-faced, mealy-mouthed people reciting truisms and platitudes and half measures. And although we can fixate on the particulars of what Trump said and how it's racist, xenophobic, sexist, etc., the real point, as so many of his followers said so many times, is that he said what he really thought. Now, for my personal take, I don't think he said what he really thought. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. I just can't help but feel that it's awful funny that every time he says what he supposedly really thinks, it aligns with what a particular group of people wants to hear. You never hear him saying something that completely shocks and offends some of his followers, except perhaps in private. He's not publicly saying what kind of sucker would go die for their country. He's not going to say that out loud. He might imply it about John McCain, but, they can chalk that up to his personal grudge. He might insult service members and his own followers, amongst close allies, people he thinks won't snitch. But by and large, when he says what he supposedly really thinks, it's within the confines of what a certain group of people wants to hear. And he knows what they want to hear because, for one, they've been conditioned in what they think is true by right-wing propaganda for decades now. So it's not particularly hard. An alien who came down from Mars and watched Fox News for a couple of hours would be able to figure out what to tell a right-wing audience, how to deliver a message that they want to hear. It's not particularly rocket science. So, long story short, I don't really believe that he says exactly what he really thinks, but the fact that he's willing to say things that other politicians won't, even if the reason that no other politician would say it is because they all know better. His instinct is to say, well, if they won't say that, if that's not the point of view that they're going to take, then it just must be because the political consensus is entirely wrong and I'm going to go in the opposite direction. It's what I call the zag theory of Trump politics. If conventional wisdom says zig, Trump has to zag. And by being able to say not what he really thinks, but what other politicians simply wouldn't say, it's refreshing. And by going after, the enemies that certain people want to see attacked, by saying the provocative things that other politicians won't say, people will say, finally, someone who is saying what I want to hear, someone who is standing up, etc., etc., etc. And that is so much more empowering than just, the Joe Bidens of the world. And I think if you're on the left and you're struggling to understand this, I think the same thing is basically true of Bernie Sanders. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to morally equate Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Don't confuse what I'm saying here. But I think that in the regards that Bernie Sanders is someone who, from the point of view of somebody, a progressive, somebody on the left, somebody on the far left, speaks truth to power, challenges the systems and the establishments and the corporate power structure, etc., that is so much more empowering. They feel so much more invested in that candidate because he's cutting through the BS, he's speaking the truth to power, and there's so much more behind Bernie than somebody like a more conventional politician, Joe Biden, who has, a more milquetoast approach, a more centrist approach. He's not going to go off on a tangent about corporations and millionaires and billionaires and the sorts of rants and riffs that Bernie will go on. And, of course, they're not going to be as excited about that, particularly when they actually start comparing votes and policies. It's just not as empowering when the candidate isn't willing to go beyond the rather narrow ideological bounds of conventional politics. And that, I suppose, leads me to another tentative point. It would seem that amongst the reasons that Democrats did not have the tidal wave tsunami blowout that they were hoping for was that the move to the left of the Democratic Party is scaring enough of middle America to keep them more or less willing to vote for somebody like Trump. So, for all the people who are saying, Bernie would have this, Bernie would have that, there would have been no contest, we'd have won the Senate, and, he would have won all 50 states or whatever they're believing at this point. Like, look, I don't want to bash Bernie. I really don't. But, gotta be brutally honest here. I don't think that in terms of winning at a national level, that the United States is ready to go anywhere near that far left. So as I said before, there is still much, much, much work to do. And how the far left and progressives can make inroads, that's a whole video unto itself. I think at the very least, you have to be able to break down to middle America how Medicare for all is not going to turn America into Soviet Russia. It's sort of ridiculous that you would even need to have that conversation, but here we are. So that's that. After consulting my whiteboard, I realized there's a point I want to circle back to. Let's consider a scenario in which another Republican other than Donald Trump runs in 2024, which will happen. Could they recapture what Trump did? And again, I would say, obviously it depends on exactly who the person is, but unless they have that extra oomph of getting those otherwise disenfranchised voters, then I think that the Democrats stand a much better chance against another Mitt Romney, another John McCain, than they would against another Trump, if there'll even be another Trump anytime soon. Because I think that just as there were all the Bernie Sanders supporters who said, Bernie will win by turning out the youth vote and the vote that otherwise wouldn't have turned out, to a significant degree, I think that's what Trump did on the right, is that he engaged and activated people who would just be turned off by a Republican equivalent of how the left views Bernie Sanders. They obviously, I'm sure there were plenty of MAGA people who were going out for Romney and voting for Romney, and plenty of conventional Republicans did, obviously, but they weren't flying Romney flags on the back of their pickup trucks and going down the highway or on their little boat parade or whatever. The level of energy and enthusiasm wouldn't be there for just a conventional Republican candidate. So who knows what demonic hordes of nonsense the Republicans will vomit up next, right? I don't know. But assuming that Trump can somehow be taken off the board from running again, I would say that a conventional Republican candidate would do significantly worse than Trump, which isn't to say that Democrats have any reason to be sanguine about 2024, but it is to say that we may not be facing this exact scenario again in the immediate future. So I think that's more or less all I have to say for right now, other than just random thoughts that couldn't be woven together in anything resembling a coherent fashion related to these subjects. If you're watching this video within the first couple days or first several days after I uploaded it, it may be relevant for you to know that sometime next week, maybe Tuesday, Wednesday-ish, I'm planning to do what I'm going to call Paint and Chill, where I'm going to have a YouTube hangout while I'm painting some 40K miniatures, and then also in that time frame, maybe a little bit later than that, on my Twitch channel, I'm going to be doing another live stream wrapping up Mass Effect 2. I've got the final mission to complete, and then I'll be done with that game, and then I can move on to Mass Effect 3, and then when I'm finally done Mass Effect 3, I can move on to a completely different franchise, because no, I'm not going to do Andromeda, because that's a completely separate game that I've heard bad reviews of, but I do own it, by the way. So I'll have to contemplate what video game I'm going to stream after I'm done with Mass Effect. Just on the subject, I did buy a new copy of Red Alert 2, and when I did a stream of the Red Alert Remastered, there were a few people asking for me to do a stream of Red Alert 2, and the version on Origins I've seemed to be getting to actually work with OBS, whereas the copy that I've had for probably over a decade was not working with OBS, so I was just getting a black screen. So at some point in the future, I might do a stream on my YouTube channel of Red Alert 2 by popular demand. And by popular demand, I mean, 2 or 3 people asked for it. So that's that. Have a good whatever time it is. And you know what? I've been waiting 4 years to say this. You lost. Get over it.